Hey, I'm Austin Gil. I am a senior developer advocate at Akamai, where I get to focus on cool things like edge compute technology, which is really awesome and exciting. You should definitely ask me about it. Over there, that's Nugget. He is the goodest boy at my house, and he focuses on foodies, nappies, and squirrels. Also very exciting, more exciting for him, I think. This is a live conference. I thought, wouldn't it be funny? So the organizers don't have a video of my presentation. They don't have my slides. And I thought, wouldn't it be funny to give a talk just about my dog? I'm not doing that, but it would be funny. Instead, I'm giving a talk called Thinking About Accessibility So Nobody Else Has to. And really quick, I just want to do an introduction for the folks that either don't have experience with accessibility or just little experience. If you've ever wondered where the term ally comes from, or A11Y, there it is. And accessibility is the practice of making your web apps and websites and web applications usable by more people. A lot of people think of accessibility in terms of visual impairments and keyboards and screen readers. And in fact, there's a lot of impairments that go into it, such as hearing, mobility, cognition. There's also technological impairments, device power, internet access, things like that. And it's good to keep in mind that impairments can also be temporary. Maybe you've got your eyes dilated or you broke your arm or something like that. A term that we're going to be using a lot is WCAG, so I want to make sure you're aware of it. It stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they're basically guidelines for accessibility of content on the web. So why should we care about accessibility? And the truth is that by focusing on accessibility, we actually get a lot of positives. One is, by the very nature of it, we are focused on making things accessible to more users, which means more conversions, more sales, more signups, things like that you might care about. Also, when we focus on accessibility, a lot of it goes hand in hand with writing different markup, which can actually be better markup. And it makes a lot of robots very happy, particularly things like Google's search spiders. We also get the benefit of legal compliance. In certain regions, there are laws that require websites now to be accessible, and you may want to avoid lawsuits. And last and most compelling in my case is the ethical benefit of focusing on accessibility. When I build stuff for the web, I want to build it for the most people possible. And I think I feel pretty crappy if people can't use the things that I build. So that's quite a subjective thing, but that's how it applies to me, maybe to you as well. There's some hard truths I want to cover about accessibility, and that is the fact that it is hard. Some advocates will say it's not once you learn it, but the fact is that it is difficult to learn. It takes a lot of time, and it's hard to implement correctly. It's also hard to remember. Once you've learned something and you go throughout a couple of months or years, it's hard to recall the right way to do some things. It's also hard to implement. Certain things are easy once you've learned them, and some things take a lot of effort to actually make it accessible. And if you go through your life in the context of an able-bodied person, it can be difficult to test your work with assistive technology that you don't use every day. Some other hard facts about accessibility are that there is a report that goes out every year called the Web AIM Million Report, which tests the accessibility of the top 1 million websites, just the homepage. And in the report last year, they found 51 million distinct errors, which is an average of 51 errors per page. And again, that's only the homepage of each of these top million websites. The most common issues are broken down here: low color contrast, missing labels, images without alt attributes, things like that. And the important thing to take away from these metrics is that these numbers are gathered from robots that can measure, that can be automatically sent out to measure WCAG metrics. They're not humans that are going to these. So in fact, humans could actually catch other accessibility issues. So this isn't entirely comprehensive. It's probably a greater number. And by now, you might be thinking, well, that kind of sucks. And it does. Because the challenge is, how do we get more people involved with the efforts of accessibility? So some approaches that I see online are people that are educating others and advocating for accessibility. Some people plead and try the guilt trip approach. Some others send warnings and threats about, you could end up with lawsuits or fewer users. And these are all valid approaches. They appeal to some people and make an impact. But I always thought that there could be another approach, and that is to actually meet people where they are. What I mean by that, we'll get into. So if we're talking about designers and meeting designers to fix accessibility concerns, we're really looking at, one of the biggest impacts is that color contrast issue. And so we want to meet them in the context of where they work, which might be design software. Before we get into that, I want to take a moment to look at a quick anecdote where if you were making a design and you had a design with a background color, some badass background color like BADA 55, and you know that in order to be WCAG AA compliant, you need a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1. The question is, what color would the foreground text need to be in order to meet that standard? And the answer is, I don't know. And I don't expect you to know. And I don't expect designers to know off the top of their head. So rather than giving them tools or asking them to step out of the flow and use these color contrast checkers, we can meet them where they are in their design software with tools like Stark. Stark has plugins for Figma, Sketch, and Adobe. And right in without stepping out of the flow of where designers are, they can see the color contrast between two colors, just like that. Additionally, these are tools that don't integrate, but I think are worth mentioning. If you wanted to make it easy for designers to find accessible colors, there's things like Accessible Palette, which builds out an accessible color palette and shows the accessibility values of it. If a designer has existing colors and wants to see which combinations or permutations are accessible or are not, Accessible Brand Colors works. If you have something like a brand color that you're not allowed to change, but you want to get something that is accessible, Accessible Color Generator can find you the nearest alternative color to use to generate an accessible combination. Next, we'll talk to developers. And thinking of developers, the context in which they work is generally IDEs or editors, CLIs, and browsers. And the best place to meet developers, in my opinion, is right within the context of the IDE. And we can do that with extensions. It's great if we can have an extension come in and give us those little red squiggly lines that tells us, hey, you're doing something wrong here. In this case, in the context of images, you want to have an alt text. So I use VS Code. It's very popular. Some of the best tools or plugins that I've found for VS Code are Axe Accessibility Linter by DQ and Webhint. The pros of extensions are that they're incredibly easy as an individual to just install and get going. The cons are, as I get my team to grow, adoption becomes more difficult and coordinating across teams is more difficult. Not everyone wants to use the same IDE or extension, and settings can be a challenge. And so the next step that we can do is bring some of this accessibility work into our projects rather than just individual IDEs with tools like linters, which provide static code analysis to give us those little red squigglies that we like. Linters can do things like prevent us from adding unused variables, enforcing the use of semicolons or not, telling us if we prefer single or double quotes. For JavaScript projects, I like to use ESLint. It's awesome. And ESLint has some plugins. So ESLint itself is not going to do accessibility checks, but it has some plugins which will, particularly for tools like Vue, React, lit-HTML, or whatever framework you're using. It also is worth mentioning that ESLint has a CLI that works really great with pre-commit hooks, so you can check your accessibility before you commit any source code. Next, another tool that we can provide to developers is frameworks and libraries. Now, modern frameworks like Vue are based around this concept of components. And components are beautiful because we can write things correctly in one place and propagate it to the rest of our application. And if we find accessibility issues, we can fix it in the one place and propagate that fix as well. Vue itself is a little bit special because compared to some other frameworks, it provides things like required props, optional props, It has good TypeScript support. And this allows us to enforce certain accessibility or build certain accessibility practices into the components that we write so that the rest of our team can implement, such as requiring that an input has a label, or if we want to have an input with an ID, we don't need every developer to include the ID. We can use JavaScript to randomly generate one for us. And TypeScript also provides those little red squigglies that I'm such a fan of. And of course, component libraries are available, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's several out there that do have a good focus, strong focus on accessibility. I maintain one called Vuetensils. There's one called Prime Vue with very minimal styles if you want to have your own custom styles. If you like material design, Vuetify is excellent, as is Bootstrap Vue if you like the Bootstrap style. Another tool that we have available is actually CSS, so programming language that we can use. And we can write it in such a way that if we do things incorrectly, if our markup contains inaccessible code, we can throw up a big red square around where the issue is and call it out so that when we're looking at it, we see it. This sort of tool can be added to your dev environment or into your staging environment by detecting what environment you're in. And then in your production environment, you can omit the CSS file that does the accessibility checks. If you want something that's already built with a lot of rules, ally.css is a tool that's available. Next, we can get into we can start talking to code reviewers, test engineers, and QA engineers. And most of the context that they'll be working in is probably around pull request or in code review or looking at the staging site or fiddling with the CI/CD pipeline and writing tests. During pull requests, it would be, we have to do some code review and look at a lot of code. And it's really great to have a tool available like AccessLint that can do the accessibility checking during our pull request so that if we see that the accessibility is failing, we get quite quick and immediate feedback, and we don't have to go back and forth on fixing all of these individual things. We can free up some time for the code reviewer to wait until everything is accessible and then focus on the other review that needs to happen. Additionally, for users that are already spending time looking at the staging site, we can provide them with tools like browser extensions that allow to audit the website that they're currently looking at. So they don't have to go to some third-party tool and drop in the URL and do whatever. They can just click a button or look at the dev tools or something like that. And it works within the context where they exist, where they're doing their work of reviewing the staging site. Similarly to browser extensions, there's things like browser bookmarklets. Now there's a few listed here. And the thing that I like about these is that they generate a report right into the DOM and can highlight where the issues are, and you can look at the problems and it'll scroll to those problems for you, which is very handy and convenient. Next, there is the inside of the CI/CD and deployment pipeline. We've been looking at a bunch of tools that we can share with developers to sort of test our accessibility at the edge, at the individual's place. But ideally, we also want to check the sort of single source of truth, and that is in the repo where our code exists. And best place for that, in my opinion, is in the CI/CD pipeline. So there's a tool called Cypress, which is really amazing because it will run, you can write tests in Cypress that will run in an actual browser environment, not a synthetic, not a headless browser, an actual browser. The benefits there, you can get to see things like, you can test for things like accessibility much better. Once again, by DQ, I promise they're not paying me for this, but they just make an excellent product. There's a tool called Cypress Acts, which integrates into Cypress and can be injected to test those accessibility things within the browser and catch things that other testers can't, like color contrast issues. Nice thing about Cypress as well, is you can have it configured to test an entire page of your application, or you can have it test just individual components. And by integrating Cypress tests into your CI/CD pipeline with their CLI, you can actually set up your pipeline such that if a pull request is merged and it fails to pass accessibility, you can prevent it from deploying to production. So you can have fewer accessibility bugs enter into your production builds. So the caveats to all of these tools is that they're all dependent on robots or machines or code, right? And robots are not humans. That means that we can see a lot of projects that get 100% WCAG accessibility scores, but still fail to actually be accessible. So there's a disparity between what the score says and what the actual truth is, and that's because accessibility is not about the numbers. It's not about trying to get a perfect score. It's about the experience for users. So you can actually end up in places where you have a worse accessibility score with a better user experience, or a better accessibility score with a worse user experience. Oops. The other caveat is that tooling and automation does not replace real user testing. So we have to get people to actually test our applications. Now, it can help us get a lot of the process along the way, but it doesn't replace it entirely. And if you're going to implement user testing, I can't stress how important it is to actually get analytics around your users and figure out who's using your application, what devices are they using, what limitations are they facing. So some final thoughts I want to end on are that this is a little bit of my spicy take, is that, in fact, not everyone needs to be an accessibility expert, which is kind of a weird position as an accessibility advocate. And the reason is because I value diversity. I think accessibility is just one portion of the equation, where we need experts in accessibility, but we also need experts in performance, in design, in SEO, in all of these things that make up the application. I think it would take many lifetimes to be an expert in all of them. Next is, if we grab this army of robot minions that are accessibility experts on their own for certain things, that can actually multiply our efforts, and we can get the job done a lot faster. One of the key takeaways I want you to focus on is, by making it easy to do the right thing and hard to do the wrong thing, we can get people on board with accessibility without whether they want to or not, or whether they care or not. They just want to see the red squigglies go away. And again, I'll reiterate that these robots do not replace experts. They actually can be used to empower experts to unlock more time and brain energy, so that they're not focusing on the same things that robots do really well, like telling you that the alt text is missing or that the input's missing a label. So that's the end of my accessibility talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I did want to take an opportunity to give a shout out to this library that I do maintain, which is called Vuetensils. It's a naked component library that provides the markup and functionality you need to create accessible, lightweight, and on-brand applications. And the way it does that is by focusing on the markup and the functionality, but it ships almost no styles at all. So you can create whatever designs you want. Now, if you like material design, probably not the right choice, because there's already a library that does that for you. But if you want custom styles, it's pretty cool in my opinion. It has 0 dependencies besides Vue Demi, which is required for Vue 2 and Vue 3 support, and it's got some cool stuff. You should check it out. So in closing, I just want to say thanks. Here's some helpful links if you like the talk. I wrote an article that basically outlines a lot of the same stuff. Vuetensils, I have a newsletter. I'm on Twitter, Twitch, and Nugget is on Instagram. So, check him out at Nugget the Mighty. That's all the time I have. I hope you enjoyed it, and that's it.